is NAB Show Live.
Convention Center. Wow, that was a lot. Over the next few days, actually over the next week, we're going to have a lot of stuff for you. You're going to know what's the latest and the greatest in terms of broadcast, sound technology, film technology, display technology, immersive technology, which is my personal field of expertise. And every day we have something special for you, and Ryan Salazar, the great God Ryan Salazar, who is responsible for Broadcast Beat for all of what we're going to see this week, will be on the floor also bringing you the latest and greatest in technologies. And if you stick with us until Thursday afternoon, we have a fun session at the close where we show everything that we think is really cool. We've got a bunch of hosts for you, so this is NAB Show Live. And we're going to start out now with my first guest. You are the inaugural guest, Pete Ludé.
What an honor. Thank you, Brian.
You're welcome from Mission Rock Digital. I'm honored to have you. And you know what? The guy that goes first out of the plane.
What does that mean?
That means you get to the ground before everybody else.
Yeah,
so hopefully you get there peacefully and land on your feet.
I'll send a report following today's experience.
So you have been in the business forever. And I actually want to talk about how I found you, because technology moves so very quickly. Mm-hmm. I've had a complaint for years about there not being standards established.
Yes.
And now I'm an immersive producer, and we are doing a special series, and we needed to be able to capture these celebrity personalities in this interview series in the most innovative and real way possible.
Sure.
So we toured volumetric studios, like 4 of them. We looked at various different technologies, and then John Canning from Digital Domain said, I have found the boys for you. It's Visby. And we went and saw the demo, and the next thing I knew, Ryan Dam from Visby said, you've got to meet Pete Ludé. He's doing standards for this. So before we talk about standards for light field technology, which is what Visby does, which to me is the most exciting, and we're going to let you technically explain it, I'd like to just get a little bit about your background, because you have written a lot of technical papers, but you've also been responsible for a lot of standards, yes?
Well, I've been involved with standards for a long time. I started my career in broadcasting years ago, back before the interwebs and all those things were out there, and cut my teeth in OB vans and live production and that. For the last 15 years or so, I've been very involved with digital cinema and advanced technologies, when we started to digitize the whole workflow for creating cinematic digital. And we created motion picture projectors that were able to use digital instead of motion picture film. I had my own company for many years called Ludé Broadcast Engineering. That was an integrator, but that was acquired by Sony some years ago.
So let's go back for less technical. When you see an integrator, your company was responsible for?
Building facilities. So for instance, Christian Science Monitor decided they wanted to go from the newspaper to the broadcast business, and I had a contract to build all their studios and broadcast playback facilities. I worked for the Olympics, for the Goodwill Games, built many TV stations, because it takes a lot of special work, a lot of installers, draftsmen, architects to be able to put together that whole interior of the service, and you learn a lot doing that.
So Immersive comes along. We're about, not counting virtual sets, but we're about 5.5, maybe 6 years into the industry from a consumer standpoint. And now we're at this place where people want more and more real immersive experiences, especially in enterprise, oddly enough, even before entertainment. So when you look at the immersive business, because cameras change, there's just, I'm overwhelmed as a producer, because we have to match the camera to what we're doing. We literally have to make the technology serve the story. And every day there's something new, and my complaint was, there's no standards. There's nothing to go from. There's not even a standardized workflow. So can you comment a little bit about the state of the industry?
Well,
and why you went towards light field?
Yeah, so I would take exception with you a little bit on that, because immersive has been around for a long time. It's just that it's been evolving as technology has evolved. So when sound came out, back in early 1920s for film. That was considered to be very immersive. My gosh, there's no longer an organ. I could hear the actors speaking on screen. When color came out with Technicolor, when fast editing, fast cut, nonlinear editing became available, when we went to widescreen with Cinerama, when we went to high definition television 25 years ago, that was considered immersive. Now it looks like I'm there compared to what we had before. And sound, it went from mono to stereo to 5.1 to 7.1. So I think it's just this continuum of new technologies that allow you to break down the barriers between the image and the sound and the viewer. So you can tell your story in more immersive ways. There have been standards out there that have been taking most of these steps along the way. So there's standards for object-based sound. What you ask about my involvement with standards, in the past years I've been president of the SMPTE, Society of Motion Picture and Television Engineers, which of course is responsible for many of the standards that affect our industry. And personally, I headed up the standards group for over 5 years now that's been standardizing immersive sound for cinema and now for home entertainment. And you can kind of see this process playing out where as new technologies become available, as you're able to do 2K, 4K, 8K, 16K images, as you're able to do high dynamic range, stereoscopic 3D, then the technologists invent something and the business people work with them to create a standard for interchange. Light field is sort of the next level up, maybe the next order of magnitude up, creates a whole bunch of new challenges for the standards process. So we'll be talking about that. But I would just, a big picture, I think it's an evolution, not a switching a switch to go to immersive.
But so when I speak of immersive, I'm actually right now talking about the experience of actually being in an HMD, being in a head-mounted display, and what that means to the user. And the hardware keeps changing. So now you've got, HP just announced a new headset last week, or 2 weeks ago, called the Pixel. We're going to be talking about that this week. And so you have a user experience that gets in, people naturally want to feel and touch around, so there's interactivity that's a part of that.
And haptics and sound.
And new AAA games and things. But the images, I mean, I agree, sound without image, and it's funny that you say there are sound standards, because when we created the piece My Brother's Keeper, and we used Technicolor sound, the gentleman that was working on that had to develop a whole new workflow for what we wanted to do.
That's very true, and when I'm being specific here because the standards run a few years behind the leading edge innovation, and what's standardized right now is object-based sound to give it an immersive experience in a movie theater. So before you had a 5.1 sound in your theater and you could use different channels, but now you have this concept of objects. So the hummingbird, the helicopter, the arrow zooming by are rendered as a specific sound essence, and that essence is mapped in real time in the theater to whatever speakers it should be coming from based on your seating position. So this is sort of a new paradigm in the way that sound can be reproduced in a theater, but you're right, there's a lot more to do in order to get to a 6 degree of freedom, free roaming, egocentric sound field where you can actually walk around and, you know.
It's fascinating to me, and I'm seeing it happen. Of course, it's always been in video games, you know, like Grand Theft Auto, you drive up and the sound of where you're approaching gets louder as you approach it, and you know, but now inside of a headset, for when a sound comes, because you're using, as a director, you're also using sound and image to actually direct the attention of the viewer.
Right.
So having those and watching this, and I'll admit I don't understand a lot about sound.
And being able to control them, because if you're a director, you want to create a sound cue that calls your attention over to some other area.
Exactly, and the same thing with image, because you know, in certain cases you can take traditional film techniques like bokeh and blurring the sides to draw people's attention in immersive.
Exactly.
So there is this huge continuum, obviously, in what is considered immersive. Now we have domes as well. And so the sound in domes, especially when there's artists performing on the stage and they have visuals around them.
Makes it all the more complicated, doesn't it?
It sounds like a great challenge, and it does sound like the industry, and especially when you were leading SMPTE, rises to the challenge. So I want to talk about light field and the change in image processing and what light field really is. And I know you have some visuals for us, so you can call for them from the booth by number, because we've got that set up thanks to you.
Wow, by number. Okay, yeah, so a lot of people are confused about light field. Matter of fact, the term is being misused by some companies that are out there with advanced display technologies and such. It's not really such a new idea. Light field is a method in which all the rays of light that are hitting a certain area are characterized not just by their position, but their direction. So if you think of it like I'm looking through a window, a glass window, and I'm looking through that to a bush in the near foreground and something a little bit further out there, and then a big tree on the horizon. As I move my head around, I'm able to see different reflections off those objects, different occlusion. I can focus my eyes on different objects. And that's because all those light rays are coming from the outside world through that window pane, and they're hitting my two eyes at two different spots. Now, if I replace that window glass with a display panel that's spitting out exactly those same multi-directional rays from all positions on the glass, I'd have exactly the same effect. It would be indistinguishable from reality if you did it correct. So the idea of a light field is to create not just a flat surface with a bunch of dots that represent a flat image, but rather light rays that reproduce what your eyes are actually seeing in real life.
So display technology, so if we're talking about the workflow and we're talking about how you shoot in light field, what does that entail? Because the camera then has to capture the direction of the rays as well. And if we're talking stereoscopic light field, what does that entail?
Well, see, it's even beyond stereoscopic. Stereoscopic is the use of the stereopsis brain cells, or the process within your human visual system that looks at a left and a right image. This goes beyond that. There's no left and right image. There's every image for every point and viewpoint. So if I define a certain viewing zone, maybe it's 1 meter or 2 meters wide, anywhere I move my head within it, both eyes are getting two different views, and I can move them around and get different views. So there's no longer this concept of left eye and right eye. There's a concept of millions of viewpoints that can be used for your eyes or others.
I mean, in post right now for a project we're working on, I mean literally trying to line up and get rid of, there's just this slight disparity between left and right that's enough to make you sick.
Yes.
Because of the way that
or especially vertical disparity, where they're supposed to be off a little bit.
You're not going to have that in
I
light
won't
field?
say it's easier, because what you're having to do is take a camera arrays and to combine the images into a mathematical model in a very complex fashion. So,
but you have the algorithm.
The concept is simpler. The actual implementation has some work to do on it, but there's a lot of good progress. I could show a little diagram. It might help.
That would be excellent.
To understand a little bit about light fields. If you put number 1 up there, and this will be a test of our process. Hey, I think number 1 was before that.
That number 1?
That's number 1.
There we go.
So what I'm showing here is a cutaway of a camera that's on the right, and it's shooting this picture of a yellow flower against a green background. And the way that the light field camera is constructed is that there's a main lens, taking lens, the big old blue oblong kind of in the center, and then there's a series of micro lenses. These are tiny little lenticular elements that could be in the millimeter range, and then below that is your CMOS or other sensor. So this is sort of a simplified version of the way the camera works. Now what this is to show you is that on the top picture, I'm shooting a picture of the flower, and those red lines show the traces of light going through one of those lenses, which you can think as a holographic pixel, and then spreading out into 3 or more, in fact, numerous of the CMOS images. And I've selected which CMOS photosensors I'm using in order to create that image that I see on the left, which is the flower is in focus and the green background is out of focus. Now, if I do the same image exactly and I don't move the camera mechanically one bit, I could take the picture on the bottom. So now what I'm doing is I'm simply selecting different light rays, which are already there and they're already going through all those optics. I'm just selecting them by choosing different CMOS pixels on that final strip on the right. And by doing so, I've now allowed the camera image to focus on the background, not the foreground. So in other words, all those light rays are already there. I'm simply electronically selecting which ones to give me the appropriate focal point and depth of focus and even position in XY space.
How is that selection made?
It's made computationally.
So this is computational photography.
Exactly. It's very much computational photography, and if you go to picture number 2, I'll show you what some of those
Picture number 2, Steve, our wonderful director.
Yeah, so on the left is the early versions of it. This dates back over 20 years. This is a camera array that was built with DSLRs in their early days at Stanford University. Mark Lavoie started publishing papers in 1996. Now the idea of light field goes way back, but it wasn't until 20 years ago that this computational photography made it accessible so I could take images from that 100 camera array and reconstruct them to build a three-dimensional model of what it was I want to be looking at. And then I
Is that because you had to wait for compute power to be able to do it?
Well, yes, exactly. A lot of compute power, and frankly, a lot of the mathematical algorithms that went into it were pretty elementary back in those days. They've done a lot of work both in the algorithms, the estimation, and especially in the compute power. And the right on that same picture.
If we can go back to that, Steve.
Picture 2 is
picture
sort of
two.
What's more in line today, which is a panel of microscopic little lenses. No, the one before that. No?
Whoops. Bigger. Go back. Go back.
There's a micro photograph of a bunch of little tiny cameras, little tiny lenses that can go in front of a high resolution display. So the idea is that you could use a camera array, or you could use microscopic lenses in front of a normal display.
So as we're looking at it right now, so all of those, what we're looking at, are tiny, teeny, tiny lenses.
Yeah, and those could be in a range of 100 microns, something like that. And you can go down to pixels that are as small as 5 microns. So the idea is that you could capture a whole lot of light rays coming from many, many different directions.
Are there sensors for each lens?
Yes, there's multiple sensors. Oftentimes, one micro lens will be illuminating 100,000 to 1,000,000 pixels on that sensor.
Oh my gosh!
So you need a lot of pixels.
So the rig that I saw at Radiant, that is Visby's rig,
right?
Wasn't like 100 cameras, but then what I did see, is this the rig? No, that's not the rig we're looking at.
No.
Do you want to say what we're looking at? Obviously that is a rig.
That is a rig. That was by a company called Lytro, which unfortunately went out of business.
And their assets went to Google.
Many of the assets went to Google.
That rig is at Google.
And that is called the Emerge. That was an early light field image back from those days. If you go to the slide before this, number 2, you'll see some of, oh, sorry, there.
We're numbering slides.
Yes, number 4.
Number 4.
We'll get it. There you go. Here's some different types of light field capture devices. That one in the center with those vertical slanted lines, that's the one you may have seen at Radiant Images. It's using Sony cameras,
yes,
Visby software, and it's just a more elegant mechanical means of having a
and portable.
Array. It is portable.
So what the Lytro, our storytellers, they did a whole bunch of research with storytellers to find out what we would like,
okay, good.
Which was great. But that rig was not portable, and so for us who want to shoot on location and want to take rigs, and for this particular show that we're going to be doing, this series, we have to be able to move it. So when I saw the other rigs that employ the technology, especially, I hope I'm not giving anything away here, but a rig that you could shift out the software, that you could actually do volumetric and then shift and flip and do light field within the same rig, that was portable, then that becomes something that filmmakers can actually, that it becomes usable.
Yes.
Instead of us having to go to a volumetric stage, or instead of trying to hack a rig yourself, now all of this is being done. The post-production, what's coming out of this, because we're waiting right now, so that workflow that comes out of the vertical rig that you, I'm asking out of self-interest.
How do you do that?
That comes out of the vertical rig, actually, because that's where we're talking to people who hopefully will be using these technologies. What is the workflow? What is the post-process from the image capture to the image consumption?
Well, that's a very big question, and the true answer is that it is not fully worked out yet, just like other workflows that are like snowflakes are all a little bit different. But in general, what you're doing is you're capturing a real-life image, and that could be off a relatively small camera with a micro lens array, but the problem there is that your viewpoint is very limited. You can't move your head any further than that width of the camera acquisition device. So that's the reason you'd like to go to much larger camera arrays, and those could be supplemented by things like LiDAR or structured light. So in other words, you could use things other than cameras.
So explain LiDAR.
Oh, sorry.
Just briefly.
LiDAR is a means of using infrared lasers to go out and scan an area in order to ascertain all the 3D objects that are in it.
So then you get a map.
then you get a 3D map of all the objects from that one position, and you can combine that with the images to calculate, oh, there's a chair behind this person standing next to a table, there's a wall that's exactly 2.6 meters back here.
So then do you overlay the image on top of the LiDAR map?
You can combine all of these things. There's a process called photogrammetry, which is where you have multiple camera positions and you electronically align, okay, that object on that camera is the same as on this one, so you can make a mesh, you could expand that mesh out, you could use the occlusion data, which means something is in front of another, to create a 3D map, like a mesh or
and then you
have polygons.
And then you have a holodeck.
Well, see, what you start to get into is something that's very much like computer graphics or a game engine. So what you've constructed is a 3D model of this whole thing, and then you could decide the viewpoint, which is similar to a camera in computer graphics. And so you ask about the workflow. The first thing is somehow synthesizing all of my capture devices, usually cameras, but it could be structured light, which is shining a special light pattern, usually in infrared, so it's invisible, where the camera can see it, but you can't. And from that, it can calculate where there's edges and other, it's like the way the Microsoft Kinect works.
So
all these things together and you create this 3D mesh environment.
So let's talk a little bit about standards, because you are talking about that the workflow is in progress right now, that obviously it's being tweaked out of experience, which is what happens. So tell me about the standards body.
Well, I will. Let me tell you a little bit about the way that what motivated the standards, which is the need to not just capture a light field image and render it out as a flat planar image, which is what Lytro was mostly doing, but rather there's now this thing called light field displays, which could actually reconstruct those images. And that drove a lot of the requirements for what the standards work is.
Like ATSC or whatever, like the old standards for display.
Exactly. If you capture light fields but never display them as a light field, you're always in effect down converting to like stereo or flat panel 3D. The interchange standards aren't so important because you're just rendering it out. If you're going from light field capture to light field display, oops, now the bar is raised a bit because I have to figure out a way to carry all those photons. But let me talk a little about light field displays, because this is something, light field cameras have been played around with for over 20 years. In fact, the technology goes back well over 100 years. Light field displays are much newer. If you go to slide 5.
Slide 5, please.
Picture 5. Illustration number 5, I have some examples of some of the prototype light field displays that are out there. Now, what you'll note is that these are prototypes, and one problem with the light field display is it doesn't do well on a PowerPoint or photograph, because you can't really tell what the hell's going on. But on the left is one from a company called Estendo. In the center is a multi-layer prototype built by the MIT Media Labs back about 10 years ago by Gordon Whitestein. It's called the Tensar display. On the right is a upward-facing display that's built by Fovi 3D. And all of these are different ways that actually are able to display all these rays of light from each dot on the planar surface. So as I move my head around, I'm seeing different angles. I'm seeing light reflected on one scene that it wouldn't on another. So, just like you do in real life, the lights reflect off of one direction but not another. And occlusion, which means that if there's one object in front of another, I could look around it using these types of displays.
So just a brief, if you're watching on Facebook Live and you go to broadcastbeat.com to watch the stream, you'll actually see the visuals that Pete is talking about.
And picture 6 gives you an idea of where we expect it to go in the not too distant future, which you already hinted at, which is the holodeck. So if I'm able to take these displays and build them into a mosaic and build them on a wall, and I'm able to inform each of those holographic pixels with light rays going in all directions, then when I'm standing in that room, I don't have this concept of focus anymore, because my eyes are choosing to focus on a nearby bush or the ground or the horizon or a tree. Everything is being reproduced just as it would be as if it was real right in front of you.
And I'm just wondering how, when you touch that tree, where these displays are, what they project, if you can have holograms that you can interact with in that same environment.
Well, I'll tell you, people are talking about having haptics put into that light field as well, because what you're creating there is this volumetric space, which is represented by what's called a scene graph, and we'll talk about that. So if you have this computational model of here's a branch, here's a leaf, here's a crunchy gravel surface, then if you had the technology to have haptics, which is the science of reproduced touch, then, well, yeah. And what is amazing is there is a lot of work going on in haptics that allows you to make it feel like there is something there.
And actually,
I think that's a ways away still.
You could actually be in like the Tesla suit and have the Tesla suit respond to what you're touching. So you think you're touching it, but you're really not.
It's really the sensors that are put into it.
It's just
near term, that's probably what we're going to be. But at least the suit will know when you hit a certain point in space that, oh, that's where the tree's supposed to be, so I'm going to make it feel like
this is mind-blowing.
Well, and one of the things you start to think about is, well, how do I convey all that data? And if I had it, how would I tell stories using it? So those are some of the interesting
that's
aspects.
the big thing. I mean, my job in the world is as a storyteller.
Yes.
So when I look at the technology, and actually our company's called Storytech Immersive, and the point is for the collaboration between storytellers and technologists. So I actually do a lot of this work out of self-interest so that I can learn and pass it on to other people. And every piece we do behind the scenes, so that other people can learn from.
That's great.
And see what we do.
Yeah, it's definitely a learning curve right now for how all these things are being put to use.
Pete, down the road here, they're building the MSG Sphere.
Yes.
And Obscura Digital is the company that's going to be programming what goes on inside the sphere with all of this stuff, and outside the sphere. So conceivably, in the future, if they were to renovate in 20 years, they could put in light field display.
Conceivably, that would be very expensive and very challenging, but certainly, I mean, one of the things about light field is that if you think about it, the emission surface, where the LEDs are, or whatever the panel, is sending out light rays. And the further away you are, the more light rays you need per degree. So if I move my head 1 degree over, if I'm 1 meter, 2 meters away from the display, then I can maybe do with 60 different light rays per degree. If I start to go 100, 200 feet away, then I might need a lot more light rays, which is a lot more data. But other than that, theoretically, it's very possible.
And data, my gosh, it just gets larger and larger and larger and larger.
Well, and also part of the way that the human visual system works is that once things start to get 10 meters away or so, there's not a lot of stereopsis. Your left and right eye are seeing almost the same thing. You're using a lot of other things for depth cues. There's not a lot of occlusion. Things don't move that much. So the sweet spot, really, and I think this is one of the things we'll come across in storytelling, is that area from 30 feet to 3 feet in front of you, where humans normally interact. That's where you work with people. That's where you see things, where you like to watch your music, preferably see sporting events. And so if we could reproduce that in a lifelike spot, that's the really hard thing, and that's viable with light field. Things that are on the horizon, it's actually a little bit easier.
So bottom line, light field is, I don't know if replicating is the right word, but it's replicating the experience that the human eye has. It presents us with the image that we actually do see in the real world because of the way light falls. And
that's right.
So
when you think about it, when you're sitting here, you say, well, I'm looking at the studio and chairs and all these things, and everybody's looking at their living room or hotel room right now. You're not really, those things are not, you're not really seeing them. What you're seeing is light from the room reflected off that surface and back into your eyes. So it's those light rays coming from each object into your eyes that are triggering your brain into knowing that that object is there.
You're taking me back to like the 5th grade when they explained the spectrum to us.
Oh, good. There you go.
And light spectrum and what absorbs light and what does not.
Yeah, there's really no color there. It's just a bunch of wavelengths.
The absence of all color is white. And it was like, wait, what?
Or black, depending on how you look at it. But, but I mean, the point is that there's a lot of light rays that are going into your eye, and your brain's figuring it out, and those light rays could be artificially synthesized now.
Wow. So
not easily, but they can.
So I want to go back to display technology for a moment. Will this be in our homes as flat screen displays or as surround displays, or will our walls? Because if you, I don't know whether it was here or at CES, but Corning, not too long ago, had a glass wall, and you could move your television anywhere you wanted it to be on that glass wall, which meant if you wanted, the whole glass wall could be the television.
Yeah.
So Is this the future of home entertainment, or is that like way off?
Well, I think it could be sooner rather than later. I think you're going to see it in commercial enterprises first. When you're talking about how it could be displayed, if you have a light field display technology, one of the obvious things is things like theme parks, and also for industrial use and military use. But if you're a theme park and you're telling a story and a little roller coaster people movers going around, and you turn a corner and see this giant monster or a troll city, whatever it is, you can make it look extremely lifelike, just like it's there using light field imaging. And I have the advantage of controlling the viewing position. I can afford it because it's not, and it's a closed system, so I don't have to worry about pervasive interface standards. So I think that's where we'll first see it. But I think there's a lot of motivation to have that into the home. You'll see a lot of the network providers providing mechanisms to get this data into the home. They'll be rendered. Now, maybe it's a flat panel display that's on the wall. It's equivalent to your 75 or 85 inch set. You're sitting close to it and you feel like it's a window and you're looking right at it. It could be curved. Some of the early experiments are using extended field of view by either using diagonal or curved screens around you. So it's a little bit more hemispherical, at least to a small extent, so it hits your full peripheral vision. They can also be built into eyewear.
There's this, now I'm going to go from the storytelling angle for a moment. There's this rush going on right now to capture things around the world that may disappear, whether it's
That's a good idea.
Works of art, or whether it's
archaeological,
because of the shape that the planet is in. And so that's one angle. And then combining that, there was a story out yesterday about a former prisoner who has done a publication called Inside News. And he did a story on virtual reality for prisoners to get them into the real world before they're released into the real world, so they can learn and experience what that world will be like. So there won't, to hopefully reduce recidivism, but also to reduce the anxiety of being released.
Right.
And that could be, if you're going to any foreign country and you want to know about where you're going, where you're going into an area that the country's gone, the works of art are gone, the great temple of is gone, but you can still experience it. And if you experience it in light field, you are virtually, I didn't mean to use that word, but you're virtually there.
There, yes.
So, I mean, this really holds out tremendous promise, but it also holds out tremendous promise for education and for enterprise. So the experience of being in a nuclear reactor control room, the experience of being in a Boeing,
you're right, exactly.
in a jet, and being able to respond to these different kind of simulations.
And anything that involves that, you have to forget that you're watching a display, and you started by talking about immersive being the experience of putting on a headgear and being able to look around and see in different directions. But I'd argue that it's without a headgear. I'm looking at a window just like it was really there. I'm looking at the cockpit of a jet, or I'm looking out a window that could be the hotel window in the city that I'm staying. And I don't know that it's not real. There's no clues whatsoever that's indicating to my brain that those light rays there are being synthetically generated. And I think that that has the promise of just carving away a lot of the obstacles that we face today in terms of getting people through simulations or training or emotional connection. Training and also storytelling.
I also feel like it's nuclear power for good or for evil, because there could be so many different uses for this where your intentions are not great. But that's the truth with all technology.
Isn't it? That is the case.
And we talked about when virtual reality first came on the scene, I actually personally wrote a series of essays about the moral and ethical responsibility of the storyteller when people are in virtual environments. Yeah. Because there is that line. It is like saying, okay, I can make you feel this way, but is it right to do that?
Right.
Or I can put you in this environment where you're totally fooled. That could be great if you're suffering from post-traumatic stress syndrome and I'm trying to help you through it, which virtual reality is being used for that. But likewise, if I want to induce post-traumatic stress syndrome, I can put you in an environment of that.
I think that's a very real concern, and you're right. Once you start, even with today's immersive technology, it could get very emotional in terms of you connecting with characters and situations in ways that we never really could before. And it's only going to get far more immersive with things like light field.
I just watched a volumetric piece called 100% that is directed by a friend of mine, Andy Cochran, and it's for Stand Up to Cancer. It's so beautifully done. You are in the environment with her while she's a ballet dancer who suffers from cancer and dances her salvation. And I'm getting the chills while I'm telling you about it, because emotionally, you cannot help but be pulled into it. It just, because it's all around you, because you are experienced and you have agency. It's not POV. It's not that you become a character.
Right.
You just have agency. And we also noticed, I mean, when My Brother's Keeper was at Sundance, and it's still being shown around the world because I guess it broke a lot of ground.
Yeah.
But people would come out of the headset in tears. And yes, you can sit and watch a movie and cry, but if I'm this close to your emotional experience of character, you're the character, and I'm this close and I'm watching you, it doesn't matter how cold-hearted I am, something is going to be, I'm going to feel something. So I just, it
takes it to a whole new level.
Yes, and this collaboration, this responsibility, first of all, the responsibility for standards so that people can use this and it can have widespread adoption, very important. But then, where is this set? And I have no idea what the answer to this question is. Where's the set of moral standards, that are, where does that responsibility?
That is a really heavy question, and I think that's something we're going to have to think about, but it's also a lot of other media aspects. Even before we get to immersive and light field, the fact that you can reconstruct what people are saying, you can synthesize their voice, you can synthesize you can make up entire speeches that a person appears to be making up.
So Mission Impossible of the 1960s when they had
exactly. So what we're
replicants.
We are at a point where we have to realize there's all sorts of ethical and moral and legal aspects to all these new technologies that allow us to do things like never before. And I think I'll leave that to the lawyers and
part of the difference, and if you can verify this, and then we'll talk about the standards body. But part of the difference, like, when we were exploring volumetric, and I think volumetric is great for some things and not great for other things. For example, if I am interviewing a star and I tell her, you can't shake your head like this because we can't capture your hair, so don't laugh, or don't move like this, or don't make any sudden movements. In light field, that works. In volumetric, it doesn't. But there was something that I was told, which was in the capture in volumetric, if I'm capturing in volumetric, I can do anything with that digital image that I want, and I can manipulate that image. I can even print out a little 3D model of you. But you can't do that with light field. Is that accurate? Well,
no, it's not really, because light field basically is creating a volumetric model, and it's creating it not just from one perspective, but from multiple perspectives. So it's volumetric on steroids, in a way. Now, a lot of the volumetric is this concept of cameras shooting outward in to pick up an object. And you can certainly do that with light field. You could also do a camera array shooting from in outward to capture an environment, and you could mix those two. So you could have a character that's captured on a light stage in light field as an object, and then you could put them into an environment that you captured with a separate camera array and composite those two and build your post-production. And yes, it does get a little scary, because unlike today's compression formats in which we take each pixel and just figure out a way to compress it and reconstruct it, now we're creating a 3D model and we are rendering it out again, very much more like a game engine. And so it's conceivable that certain aspects of that rendering could be altered. And matter of fact, let me talk about that a little bit, because that's one of the big differences when we talk about standards for light field. And I want to remind everybody about 6 degrees of freedom. And I think I even have a little diagram that helps us remember that.
Great.
Number 9. And
6 DOF.
6 DOF, it's called. And what that means is that...
Number 9. There we go.
When you're looking around, if I'm stationary sitting in my chair, I could move my head back and forth, pitch, roll, and yaw, they call that, up and down, back and forth. But I could also, if I'm not having to sit in a chair, I can move left and right, forward and back, and up and down. those are my 6 degrees of freedom. I could move around the viewpoint for that image. And that creates some really interesting challenges when I talk about compressing an image transmission, because if I move my head to the left, I can now see around objects that I couldn't see before. In effect, I'm looking at a different viewpoint altogether. So I can't just take one planar or flat image and construct it. I need to really have this whole 3D model space that allows me to move around. And that's where light field image formats need to really excel to be able to carry that forward.
So I've actually experienced six stuff. I've actually had a car fly over my head that I had to duck.
Okay, good.
And you could look at, as it passed over, right. you could see it. And now you have Oculus Quest coming out, that'll be 3DOF. But 6DOF is, what you're doing is you're now taking light field technology with the way we see and combining it with the way that we actually move.
So it's, yes, you can either, if you're wearing a headset, you need to render that out based on your position, but if I'm on a giant light field display panel, there's no rendering based on your position. The light rays are actually there all the time. I'm simply moving and seeing different ones. I want to step over and see the bass player. I want to go see the actress from the side in terms of the front. Those light rays already exist. They're already being transmitted out. It's just a matter where I choose to stand.
You know, it reminds me, at its very simplest, in the Franklin Institute, when I was a kid, they had a picture on the wall and the eyes followed you wherever you went.
Oh, yeah. That's scary.
I don't know how they did that, but you know, if you look, it just kept following you, and it was like, well, is it one giant thing? But it wasn't. It just looked like one eyeball. And
yeah. Those concave statuettes.
So, of course, I'm always thinking, you've really expanded my universe, so to speak, today, because I'm always thinking of what it is to be fully immersed and to be kind of like sensorily deprived from what's out here, as opposed to be immersed in an environment where I don't need glasses. And where do you think we're going on that? Will both be valid? Will head-mounted displays go away?
Well, I think there'll always be a place for head-mounted displays, but I don't think it's necessarily desirable. If you could do without them, you should do without them. And the idea is that with a properly constructed, high-resolution light field display, you're going to see all these light rays and objects in real life without any headgear at all. And I'll see them in stereo. I'll be able to move around, and I'll feel like I'm really there.
How would you overlay data into that, like augment that world? Would we still have augmented reality glasses and light field technology? Well,
you could. I mean, if it's as simple as you wanted to add lower third titles or some other graphics onto the screen, you could reconstruct those just as if they were, you know, solid objects hanging in space in front.
But to make those elements, we're back to interactivity.
Okay, that makes it more complicated.
if you have the AR glasses and you're reaching and the camera is tracking and you touch that, then you get information. I mean, that's the promise of AR.
I think you're hitting on the key point that we have a lot to learn in terms of all the ways to reconstruct these.
I hope I live long enough.
See, and you're in the storytelling business, so there's a very interesting aspect of this that we're starting to do thought experiments and saying, okay, so I'm in a lifelike environment. I have some people also have this thing called 3DOF plus. Remember, 3 degrees of freedom, or when I could simply move my head around, up and down, back and forth, but from one spot. But and 3DOF plus means, well, maybe I can move it a little bit to the left and right, but if I truly have 6DOF and I can step 3 feet to the left, suppose I'm telling a story, and I use this example, maybe you could put up the next slide 10, photo 10.
Slide 10.
I use this example of, I'm a cinematographer, I'm shooting a war scene, and I have all these soldiers heading at me. And in the old days, I would stick my camera on a tripod, my IMAX, and these guys would zoom by me left and right, and it would be terrorizing, but I know they wouldn't hit me. But now I'm 6DOF, so I can step 3 feet to the left, and the filmmaker doesn't know that, because every viewer could be in a different spot. So what do? Does a horse crash into
Trample you?
Or does the horse become a ghost and mysteriously pass through you? And then you say, well, that's not real at all. But you know, one way to think of it is that, well, all those horses are being rendered to be displayed on this panel, so why couldn't we use some other video game techniques to slightly alter their vector trajectory and have them scoot around me wherever I am? So I can move to the left and the horse kind of responds by moving around to the left. That could be a storytelling technique that we're able to use in the future. And there's many other examples of this. So you mentioned simple agency or connection. Put up the next picture 11, please. And one of the things that I've seen a lot is eye connection, eye gaze. And if you have actors or, in this case, a wonderful man's best friend looking at you, then that has a tremendous emotional connection. And if I could have different people in a room and the eye gaze could shift between them as if you're in the same room with them, that's a very minor augmentation to agency. So it means that I'm not really affecting the story by sitting there, I'm not really part of the story, but now I really feel like I'm part of it because it's like the characters seem to know that I'm there. And that's, again, something that's very feasible with light field displays and technology that aim the rendering aspects to whoever's in the room viewing.
Is there, well, let's talk about the standards body and then let's talk about the degree of investment that's going on in light field. So tell us about the standards body.
So a number of companies have gotten together over the past few years have been talking about this. And one of the things that came out is the need for an interchange standard. It allows you to represent these complex light field images in a way that's transportable. It could be sent across a network, maybe even a smart network, which is media aware and can help do some of that processing built into that distribution network, and then into any number of a variety of displays, display agnostic. And the idea was, well, this should be something that is royalty-free and open source because we don't want the interchange standard in itself to be an impediment to adoption. We want everybody to start using this. We'd like to use something that's been out there and proven to the extent it could be. And so the founders of this new coalition, which is being announced on Monday here at NAB, as a matter of fact, it's called IDEA, or IDEA, so you can, easy to remember, that stands for Immersive Digital Experiences Alliance. Immersive Digital Experiences Alliance. Matter of fact, you could put up picture number 14, so people have the website and such. There it is. And this has been founded, the founding members include Visby, who you met with Ryan Dam, leaders in image capture, Otoy, another leading company which has contributed a standard that I'll be talking about called Orbix, which is a way of representing this three-dimensional volumetric model with all the texture and color overlays to it for light fields. Also, Cable Labs, which is a coalition of all the cable MSOs based out of Colorado.
That's great that they are in.
Yeah, they're actually a key leader for making this happen because they're seeing the opportunity to be able to make this happen. And another very important company called Lightfield Labs, based in San Jose, which is among the leaders in creating this new light field display technology. They've been showing their prototypes for over a year now and have impressed an awful lot of people in Hollywood with the fact that light field displays really are possible. We know cameras are possible. Okay, how do we make this into an ecosystem? And also, it's not even in a press release, but Charter Communications has also decided to join up. And I think you'll see a lot of other people joining up as well. And this group will be forming, there'll be working groups that are starting with what's called this Orbix format, which is a very mature and sophisticated means of taking objects and spaces within a certain environment. So it's a volumetric on steroid. We're able to take all these different aspects. You're able to overlay colors, textures, specular reflections from different angles on one angle, not another. Currently, Orbix has been used extensively as an interchange format for the Octane renderer to be able to transfer files, three-dimensional files between different computer graphics devices. Now it's being augmented to be able to support everything needed for light field, and this is what IDEA will be working on, starting with a proven format, building it up, adding in the additional audio, which we talked about, and sound standards to mix immersive sound field along with objects in order to create a complete interchange format, which is for mezzanine, a version for streaming, and I would imagine into archiving and into other uses for the workflow.
Where's the processing power and the data storage for this happen?
That's a terrific question. I think the answer is that you need a lot, and it's likely to fall into two places. First of all, in order to have a relatively small payload across your network, you have to encode or represent the images into these meshes and what's called a scene graph, which is a file structure that looks like a tree, and you have, here's a scene and all the different elements that can go down with as much detail as necessary. To reconstruct that scene graph, you're going to need a good deal of GPU power in the display. So it'll be like sending a file along and having a display that's able to reconstruct and light up each of these millions of light rays and billions of pixels. There you go, thank you. There's the scene graph, which shows you that tree structure of all the different elements that are called nodes, and putting those together. Pretty common for computer graphics, not so common in terms of standards for interchange of media data, and that's why I think that IDEA is onto something new. This is going to be called the Immersive Technology Media Format, ITMF, and the initial draft actually is pretty far along. I think it'll be released publicly within this calendar year. And there's also hopes to be able to do some demonstrations and plug fest to be able to show how the ITMF format can be used to represent light field images from different devices to capture both cameras and computer graphics to different display devices, including light field displays, but also to head-mounted displays, to AR and VR devices.
There's so much I have between thin client and, like, okay, what's at this end, what's at that end, what's the bandwidth and the data requirements that are needed, what's the security that's needed, because it's stuff that you could do evil things with.
Yes.
Is IDEA global?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, where is most of the research on light field being done now?
That's a great question. I mean, the research on light field goes around the globe. People like Fraunhofer have been doing a tremendous amount of work on it in Germany. Big companies like Philips, even companies like LG and Samsung. A lot of the most innovative work I'm seeing is coming out of the startups, many in the Bay Area. Google has a lot of work that they're doing on light field imaging based on some of the assets that they acquired, and even before that, some of the experts that they brought on board. And startups like Visby in San Francisco and Light Field Labs in San Jose are leveraging all the computer graphics expertise and also optics expertise that exists in technology hubs.
So the timing of IDEA is perfect.
I really think it is, because this technology really is coming along. It's not something you're going to necessarily see commercialized at NAB 2020, but you are going to start to see industry demonstrations and trials, and I think people are going to start to figure out how this could be used. And the processing power is a very important point, because it's one thing to talk about piling a bunch of GPU power into your display device, obviously that gets expensive, but the other opportunity is that if your network, your communications network, already knows that it's sending light field payloads, then it could do a lot of the heavy lifting even before it hits the customer premises. And that's one of the things that Cable Labs and their partners have been really looking at. They've already, in the cable industry, have enclosed and implemented metadata and processing power to be able to recognize advanced video codecs that are going through.
So the infrastructure is...
The infrastructure, and you can simply build onto the infrastructure that if you have it available, it could take some of the heavy lifting away from the display, or it could even render out to say that my network could know if I'm going to a 3D television or a light field display or the next version of Oculus or Vive, and it could render out the image appropriate for those display devices. The dream is it's display agnostic. Once I have this highest order of magnitude, once I have this highest common denominator of all this data, then I could reconstruct it into anything less than a light field display, in theory, and have it best possible viewing experience.
Well, Pete, this has been like taking a 600 level college course for me. It's like a steep learning curve, but at the same time, have faith. I'm one of those storytellers that is actually going to use light field technology for this next series. Thank you for being here today. I wonder, Steve, if you could just put up the IDEA slide one more time so that people can see where the website is.
And a plug, you'll see the website. There's some preliminary information. There'll be a lot more there. There is an event. It's invitation only, Monday evening. But if you feel that you should have been invited and weren't because you're in the industry and this is something of interest to you, we'd very much welcome you. So please go to that website, immersivealliance.org. immersivealliance.org, and on there you'll see learn more about the NAB event, and if you click that you can send a request to get invited to our hush-hush secret fancy events on Monday evening, which will be talking a lot more about this and introducing you to the founders.
Yeah, our director wants to know, is there a secret handshake?
There is.
There is.
It's a holographic handshake, and I'm sorry I can't share that with you right now.
Great. All right. Pete Ludé, thank you so much for being here today and for being the first guest. And we're going to be right back. Where's my tally light? We're going to be right back